Imagine you and your family go outside. Your mother is clothed in solid black. All that's showing on her is her eyes. She's walking 10 feet behind your father. You've never seen your mother but her eyes. Imagine that you have a relationship with God where He doesn't talk to you, He doesn't hear you, He doesn't seem like He cares for you. He seems a million miles away rather than living in your heart and in your temple. Imagine if our country was founded as an Islam nation. Today I want to talk to you about being prepared in and out of season. The effects could last a lifetime. Today's talk centers around the Battle of Tours, which occurred in 732 AD. There's a famous painting of it right there. In 732, actually 10 years prior to 732, there was a guy named the Duke. The Duke lived in the center of two major world powers. He had the Franks to the north, and he had Islam to the south. The Duke ended up getting into a skirmish with the south, with Islam, and he won. To be honest, he got the jump on him, and he got lucky. So after he goes back to his palace, he gets to thinking, he's like, you know what, I got the Franks to the north, and I've got Islam to the south. I need to form an alliance. So my mom and my dad always told me, when you choose your friends, choose wisely. The Duke did not, however. He chose Islam. He chose the south. Well, anyways, the guy he buddied up with decided to revolt against his own nation, Islam, and they took the sword to him. Well, the Duke there, he's guilty by association, so Islam turns their focus on him. At this point, about 10 years had passed. Anyways, Islam comes through on their horses, on their cavalry, and they meet the Duke's army, infantry on foot, and they just plow right over these guys. It was just awful, and history shows that there was a lot of blood loss and just lives lost. Anyways, the Duke somehow escaped, and he realized, man, I made a poor decision. So he contacts the Franks up north. Enter Charles Martel. Charles Martel was the mayor prince of the palace and of France. Anyways, the Duke says, Charles, I need your help. I need you to fight for me or fight with me. And Charles is a very witty, very resourceful guy. He's got his act together. He says, yeah, sure, Duke, no problem. But I'm going to need you to pledge your allegiance to us, the Franks, your land, your people, any resources you may have. So the Duke all had options. He says, yeah, sure. So Charles Martel goes to work. Charles Martel, he takes his army that he's got ready for battle, and he stays off the Roman roads. He goes up behind the mountains into a flank position where he can get the jump on the Islam army. Now see, the Islam army, their scouts had come through and took care of the Duke. However, the larger army was moving much slower behind. So Charles and his guys, they get together, they get up on this hill. In battle, you never want to let the enemy pick. You never want to let them pick the battlefield. Well, Charles had the upper hand because he got to pick the battlefield. He chose a key location up on a hill where there was a bunch of trees. And so Charles and his guys took a rectangular flank formation, and they held their ground, and they waited for Islam to show up. So finally, Islam, the scout army, catches up to where Charles is. Now, see, they've got their cavalry, but that ain't going to do too good when you got to run the horses uphill through the trees to run people over like you did the Duke. But Charles knew that, so he had picked his location. He picked it wisely. I can just see these guys, the Islam army, going along laughing, joking, drinking, whatever, and talking about how they pillaged the last town. And, it's October, the air's cold, you can see the breath coming out. And then they hear something. Did you hear that? What was that? And they look up on the hill, and here's the Franks. Here's the Franks, and they got just full armor on. These guys are said to have 75 pounds of armor. To help put that in perspective, Goliath, from David and Goliath, had 125 pounds of armor. So they wasn't far off dressed from what Goliath was. If you really want to picture it, picture Tony Stark, the Iron Man. Or in this case, my last name being Chapman, we'll call him Iron Chapman. That is a good-looking army right there. Anyways, so here's Islam. They look up. They got a choice. We've heard about Tours, France here. We've heard about their temples, their gold, their treasures. We need to either go forward or go back. And go back apparently wasn't a good option. So for 7 days, Islam and the Franks, they had a couple skirmishes there, but it was more like a standoff. And the Franks, they held their ground. They did not move. And in the meantime, the larger army, led by, and I want to make sure I say this right because I'm only going to say it once, led by Abdul Rahman al-Ghalfiki, which from now on we will be referring to him as Big Al for brevity purposes. Anyways, so for 7 days, couple skirmishes, Big Al and the army show up. But little did he know, Charles at the time, Charles had been waiting on his seasoned warriors to show up, and they had showed up. So now you've got the two major world power army commanders facing off I would say face to face, but one was much higher than the other, so we can't say that. But anyways, Big Al had a problem. He looks up in the army here. Number one, Charles had him by surprise. He had picked the battlefield, which it was not good for Al because he had an elevated position. Number two, he couldn't see over the hill to tell how many of Charles's warriors were there. There could be 1,000,000 guys behind that wall. Number three, Islam records show that they had no knowledge of the Franks before this Battle of Tours in 732. So therefore, they didn't know how good these guys was. And number four, it was October, and Charles's guys was dressed for winter, and Islam was not. So Al had the major decision, forward or backwards. And Charles Martel, he placed a gamble that Al would proceed, and Charles Martel won because Al decided to proceed. So here comes the day of the battle. Big Al decides, well, you know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Let's go with what's worked in the past. Let's send the cavalry up there and run them over. Well, he tried it once. They went up the hill. It didn't work, going through the trees and trying to get these guys. He sent them again. It didn't work, and they come back down the hill. Well, Charles, he had one more trick up the sleeve there. He sent some of his guys around back, not to the back of the army, but he sent them to the last town that Islam had pillaged, and he started pillaging what they had pillaged. He started stealing the stuff from them that they stole from somebody else, and Big Al's army heard about this. They're like, hey, they're back there pillaging our stuff. You know, what are we going to do? You know, and so a couple of these guys broke formation. Meanwhile, Charles's guys, hell, they start taking off. They go back to the last town to get their stuff. The rest of Abdul's army here, Big Al's army, sees that these guys are breaking formation, and they think, well, retreat, retreat. So they started retreating. Big Al's trying to hold his army together here and keep them from retreating, but it was at this point that Charles's army came down, and Al became Al, see you later. Amen, somebody. So, long story short, why is this story so cool? It's because Charles Martel was prepared before there was even a war, and we should be too. Well, what do you mean Charles was prepared before there was a war? I haven't told you the coolest part of this story. 10 years prior, when the Duke got into it with Islam, Charles, who lived in the north, this sent a little radar off on his map here. Boop, boop. Charles knew that the Islam was the major world powers there, but see, the Islam didn't know about the Franks up north. So what did Charles do? 10 years prior, when the Duke was fighting Islam, and won the first time, Charles set aside an elite group of warriors and he started training them every single day for 10 years. So 10 years before this Battle of Tours ever even took place, Charles Martel was preparing for it, training these guys, fighting them in martial arts and just all these other things, and getting them ready and seasoned for war. So what does that have to do with us? How does that affect us today? Well, see, Charles Martel, if he hadn't have been prepared for this fight, there was no other Christian army behind Charles Martel. Islam, like I said, was one of the two biggest world powers. If they would have went over Charles's army, there would have been no one to stand against them, no one to stop them. And there is a very, very high probability that today America would be an Islamic nation. So Charles could have never known that at the time. However, it's the reality that if Charles would have lost, Islam would have took over the planet at the time. You know, the known planet at the time, because they hadn't discovered America yet. Either way, when the Pilgrims come over, they wouldn't have been Christian. They would have been Islamic. So being prepared in and out of season, it's 2 Timothy 4:2 that tells us to be prepared in and out of season. Charles Martel was prepared in and out of season. And you might have noticed these books I've got here today. How can we be prepared in and out of season? Right here, I go to God's Bible School and College. At God's Bible School and College, I have access to my classroom 100 times a day. However, one day, God willing, I'm going to graduate and I will not have access to that classroom. So what do? I take these books, and everything that comes through these books, I print out. These represent every class I've ever taken at God's Bible School and College. Every single class I've ever taken, I have a composition notebook for that. And any discussion board, any web internet activity, any paper I got to write is in these books. Because one day, I won't have access to the classrooms, but I'll have access to these. And I tend to forget things I learned the next day, so it's always good to keep good notes. But my question today about the speech is, what are we doing to be being prepared in and out of season before there was a war? You know, like Charles here, he was prepared 10 years prior. We should be prepared. I'm leaving these behind for my kid one day. I've pursued God with everything I got, but one day I want to help her along with do that. I've been to AA meetings, I've been to PTA meetings, and you know, you can mention God just so long as his name's not Jesus Christ. You know, if it's Allah, that's okay. We're so worried about being politically correct that we don't offend anybody. And there's a war coming whether we realize it or not. And so we need to be prepared in and out of season. Charles Martel was, and if he hadn't, today the United States could be an Islamic nation. Thank you for your time.